Florida and having tea, mind you, with the assistant district attorney at his home, just making a polite social call. Meanwhile, his henchman, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, was back in Chicago bringing all of this off.
Capone thinks he's safe, protected by Chicago's corrupt cops, politicians, and judges. But the massacre backfires.
From Capone's point of view, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a disaster. First of all, it didn't accomplish its main objective, which was to get Bugs Moran. Secondly, it brought down a storm of national criticism on him and began this effort to put him behind bars.
This is where the story of the real Eliot Ness begins. On March 4th, 1929, just 3 weeks after the massacre, Herbert Hoover becomes the 31st president. He'd pledged in his campaign to get the gangsters. Now it's clear that Chicago could not or would not get Capone. Hoover has to make good his promise. The task falls not to Eliot Ness, but to George Johnson, the U.S. Attorney for Northern Illinois.
When the President of the United States tells you to do something, you do it. It would be fair to say that all energies of the Office of the United States Attorney and the Treasury Department were directed towards the Capone organization.
Working for Johnson is a young agent who's already earned a reputation for honesty, a rarity in a bureau dogged by corruption.
Eliot Ness came from a large Norwegian family. His parents were hardworking, industrious, particularly his father. He was a master baker in southern Chicago, and Ness established his value system early in life.
Ness's parents were immigrants, just like Al Capone's, but there the similarity ended.
Al Capone fought for everything he could get. That was his upbringing. He had to for survival early in life and in his early adulthood when he became involved in crime.
Capone grew up on the mean streets of New York, a far cry from the upbringing of Eliot Ness.
Eliot Ness's parents had a big influence on him, as did his brother-in-law, Alexander Jamie. He was involved in law enforcement, and Eliot was always very impressed with his brother-in-law and what he represented.
Ness vowed to become a crime fighter, so he studied law and criminology at the University of Chicago, hoping to follow in his brother-in-law's footsteps.
Ness had paid a lot of attention to the news of the day. He had read of the Al Capone outfit, Johnny Torrio preceding Capone, and their rise to power and prominence. He had a deep resentment for what they represented, and when he had an opportunity to strike at the heart of the criminal organizations with the Prohibition Bureau, he jumped at it.
Eliot Ness was really a pioneer when he was hired on because he was a cut above others that were hired in law enforcement at that time. He knew going in that this was a organization that was fighting an immovable giant, but he had the tenacity and the intelligence to think that he could challenge the system. Kind of an underdog, and America loves its underdogs.
U.S. Attorney George Johnson asked Alexander Jamie to recommend an honest man for a special mission.
Jamie had just a man in mind, his brother-in-law, Eliot Ness. Jamie was familiar with Eliot as a person and very familiar with his record in the Prohibition Bureau.
Johnson asked Ness to establish a small squad of incorruptible men to catch Capone.
Chicago was known in those days as big cities were, a place that was very violent and that everything was for sale. The only way to tackle the criminal organizations was to have a group that could not be corrupted. And so you had to have a small group of similar mind and similar background united against a common cause.
Ness picks men like him, young, tough guys with a thirst for action and a reputation for honesty. Originally the Capones Club, now known as the Untouchables. 9 men ready to do battle with America's public enemy #1. Capone was suspected of vice, extortion, and murder. He was suspected of masterminding the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But Elliot Ness, a prohibition agent, can't go after Capone the killer. He has to catch Capone the bootlegger. In quick time, the Untouchables raid 6 breweries and 5 warehouses. They destroy 200,000 gallons of beer. They seize equipment and vehicles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and make 34 arrests.
Criminal organizations had amassed a great wealth, and one of the major contributions of Elliot Ness and the Untouchables was to smash away at that economic lifeblood.
Ness is waging an economic war against Capone, but he is also fighting a battle for hearts and minds.
Twice in a few weeks, the government has struck. This time a brewery on South State Street, said to belong to Al Capone.
In the golden era of the movies, the newsreels help shape public opinion.
It's a scene of joy or sorrow, depending on how you feel about it. Either way, you're seeing $80,000 worth of destruction. Anyhow, there'll be a lot of dry throats in Chicago after this night's work. Oh, well.
Ness needed good headlines because the federal government needed good headlines in Chicago. Law enforcement needed good headlines. Basically, the underworld was getting all the press. It was a kind of a glamorized version. Capone was kind of a folk hero. But where were the good guys? We only heard about the bad guys.
Ness gave the public a new kind of hero. He is an early master of PR.
Elliot Ness was a publicity crazy person. He'd call us and he'd say, meet me at 40th and Madison Street. And we'd follow him to a brewery. And he'd take a half a dozen barrels of beer and have guys crack him up, and just to show that the government was on a job.
Capone was in prison in Pennsylvania when Ness began his raids. When he returns to Chicago after nearly a year in jail, the city is very different. Ness's campaign isn't the only problem he faces. The stock market crash of October 1929 put an end to the Roaring '20s and ushered in the Great Depression. With 1 American in 4 looking for work, high rollers like Capone are no longer admired. Capone has enjoyed popularity because he gave the public the booze they want. Now he has to fight a PR war.
Well, he started a soup, call it a soup kitchen, I guess, but it was a big warehouse. Only about a half a block away from the Chicago Detective Bureau. And he served meals, I don't know, all the hobos and unemployed or whatever went there to eat. I would guess thousands of them. And it was open 24 hours a day. And people were lined up. Most of these people who asked questions, well, what do you think of Al Capone? We think Al Capone's a great guy.
If it wasn't for our friend Al Capone roping open this here White House on 935 South State Street, we wouldn't eat.
The Depression hits Elliot Ness, too. Government money funding his war on Capone begins to dry up. Just when it looks like Ness can't continue his work, help arrives from an unusual source. When the mob begins to muscle in on the construction industry, a shadowy group of Chicago businessmen decide enough is enough.
We tend to give a lot of lofty motivations to many of the actors in this, but much of the battle was economic. The large crime outfits were siphoning a great deal of money from the economy.
Chicago is to host the World's Fair in 1933, so the businessmen know they have to clean up the city's notorious image.
They, like my father, were appalled at the conditions to which Chicago had been brought, its reputation ruined, known as a city of gangsters.
They vow to finance a private war against organized crime.
The government didn't have enough money to do it. Probably didn't have enough resolve to do it either. But with the partnership of the law enforcement establishment and the business community, it was a very effective two-pronged approach.
They set up their own investigative agency, run a speakeasy to get information about bootlegging, and give cash for Eliot Ness's raids. They spend over $1 million fighting crime. They work anonymously and become known as the Secret Six.
It was a very, very outstanding group of bankers, financiers, industrialists in this group. They gained very little publicity, but they're most instrumental in helping public officials enforce the law.
While the Secret Six help with cash and the Untouchables give the public the headlines they want, Eliot Ness's boss, George Johnson, is secretly working on another strategy to get Capone.
The federal government had one great weapon, and that is income tax evasion.
In 1927, the United States Supreme Court ruled that illegal income from bootlegging or gambling or prostitution was taxable.
We all pay taxes. We don't like it, but we do it. But someone of Al Capone's stature, who flaunted not only all decency, but would not pay his taxes. He owned a yacht. He had jewelry. He had a huge home in Miami Beach. He lived a very high style of life. Well, one couldn't do that and then declare a meager income.
The trick was how to prove the extent of their unreported income. So they went around to merchants in Chicago, usually of luxury items. How much did he spend on plates? How much did he spend on cars? How much did he spend on clothes? How much did he spend on silk underwear? How much did he spend on rugs? All these people came and testified, and as the amount, grew to the sky, it was apparent that he was spending a great deal of money.
The breakthrough comes when one of Capone's mob is overheard talking about a damning piece of evidence that was already in government hands. The mysterious clue is relayed not to Ness, but to an income tax investigator, Frank Wilson. Wilson immediately knows what the gangster was talking about, a ledger seized from Capone's headquarters.
The captured ledger was a record of the gambling dealings of the Capone organization. Therefore, it was invaluable to government investigators to show that, in fact, Capone was actually running a gambling organization, that it was actually making money, because it showed the transactions.
Wilson needs witnesses to link the ledger to Capone, and he finds them. Capone's bookkeeper, Leslie Shumway, and Fred Reese, a cashier in one of his gambling joints.
One of these guys they actually, in effect, tortured by putting him in a jail cell with cockroaches because he had a morbid fear of insects, and they finally got him to fess up that way.
Shumway and Reese know that once they testify against Capone, they're as good as dead. But in a forerunner of today's witness protection program, the Secret Six pay for Reese and Shumway to go into hiding. With Reese and Shumway's grand jury testimony, George Johnson gets an indictment against Al Capone for income tax evasion. The federal case against Capone is poised to enter its final act. A week after Al Capone is indicted for income tax evasion, Eliot Ness hits him again in another courtroom battle. In 3 hours on the stand, Ness gives evidence of Capone's bootlegging, 5,000 violations of the Dry Law Volstead Act. Capone is indicted a second time.
Eliot Ness and his group of investigators gathered a great deal of evidence on prohibition violations. They used all the techniques we use today. They did intelligence gathering, talking with informants, great deal of surveillance. The Untouchables really did have a tremendous impact.
The press hails Ness. Little does he know the acclaim will be short-lived. Four days later, on June 16, 1931, Capone comes to court. He's prepared to cut a secret deal with U.S. Attorney George Johnson. Capone will plead guilty to the income tax evasion and prohibition charges and serve 2.5 years in prison. Eliot Ness despises the secret deal.
I seethed inwardly at what could easily become a shallow victory for the law.
Capone thought that if he plea bargained, got a short sentence, he would have been able to wipe the slate clean and then go back to his life of crime when he got out of jail. Of course, things didn't work out that way.
Capone gets a shock when he returns to court expecting an easy sentence. The judge throws out the deal and orders him to stand trial. George Johnson calculates he stands a better chance of convicting Al Capone for not paying his taxes than for selling illegal booze.
The federal government was smart about this. They realized that there was very little chance that a Chicago jury would convict Al Capone of something as relatively minor as violating the Volstead Act. They did realize, however, that America resented a tax cheat, and that's what it was all about. The tax evasion case was much more winnable.
America, in the whole, wanted their alcoholic beverages at that time, and they're not going to put someone in jail that gave it to them. Whereas income tax, that's a whole different story.
Ness and his bootlegging evidence are put to one side. His headline-grabbing war against Capone turns out, after all, just to be George Johnson's cleverly designed distraction.
For all the effort that Ness and his men put into their work against Al Capone, it had to be very disappointing and frustrating to Eliot that he never got to court on the charges.
So Eliot Ness is a mere bystander when, on October 6, 1931, Al Capone is brought to trial. Like the government, Capone knows the jury would convict him, but he isn't worried.
When Capone was tried, a common practice in that time was to bribe jury members. They were easy to get to, and it was often an easy way out for everybody concerned. The judge in the Capone case, James J. Wilkerson, discovered that the original Capone jury had been bribed, and so he switched juries at the last minute.
The new jury hears evidence from the two key witnesses, bookkeeper Shumway and cashier Reese. Ness is never called to the stand. On October 17th, the jury finds Capone guilty of income tax evasion, and Judge Wilkerson sentences him to 11 years in prison.
Capone's conviction was a turning point in American law enforcement history and demonstrated, as if any proof was needed at that point, how ineffective local law enforcement could